So we're going to look at all things resurrection life during the season of Easter. And as I told you last Sunday, we're going to be looking at stories of healing, especially in the Gospels and with Jesus. Stories where Jesus would heal someone. Now, all these stories that we're going to look at starting today, they are miraculous and wonderful in and of themselves. Someone is healed. They were blind and then they can see. They were lame and then they could walk. They were oppressed by some spirit of a demonic spirit and then they were freed from it. These are all miraculous, wonderful things just all by themselves. But the Gospels, especially John, would tell us they are more than that. They are actually signs. And a sign is intended to point to something. Right? If out front we built this great sign, it was Meadows Church out there, and it was like a monument sign with bricks and a waterfall and flowers, and how cool would that be? Especially since this is another church, how cool would that be? But even as wonderful as a sign can be, it is a sign. All it's intended to do is point to something else. Point to something better, something greater that's behind the sign, that's near the sign. It's to point to something. And these miracles, these healings are pointing to something else. And what they're pointing to is what we're celebrating during Easter, which is the resurrection. Resurrection is our eternal hope as a follower of Christ. That's what we hope for eternally, that we would on the last day be raised again in the same way that Jesus was. Resurrection. And so we think about resurrection life and what that's all about. This is the season of Easter, and so we are looking at these stories of healing. Now, I warned you last Sunday, I'm going to tell you again, at the end of my sermon today, I'm going to invite you to come down and receive prayer for healing. And this is something that it may take you the next 30 minutes to wiggle out the nervousness to do, but I want to invite you to do this. I don't know what it may be for you. I don't know what your ailment may be, if it's physical, if it's mental, if it's spiritual. We're going to have a few people that are going to be down here to receive you, to pray for you. And we've talked about the sacraments before as a church. This physical means to encounter a spiritual reality, right? This is like water for baptism or bread and wine for communion. And we have with us today oil, one of the sacraments where we will anoint you with oil for healing. And this is not my idea. This is what we see all throughout the Scriptures, even in the book of Acts, as the early church begins, as they anoint people for healing. And I pray that you, someone in this room today, would respond today to come forward at the end of the service for healing. I'm believing God will do something in this season of Easter that's well beyond what I can do by myself. And I pray that we always are asking God to do that type of thing. So I wanted to put that out there for you because that's coming. But let's get into our story, shall we? Are we ready? We're looking at these stories of healing. Now, this first story takes place about a week before the resurrection. But I want to set the story up first and back up one more day, one extra day. So Jesus is working his way south, as we've talked about, south from Galilee, which is where his ministry is primarily. And he's working his way down the Jordan Valley, past the Jordan River, all the way towards Jerusalem, where he would encounter the principalities and the powers, where he would eventually be crucified. And he's working his way down. This is a several-month-long journey, and the crowds are starting to grow, many of which are joining in Jesus because it is the season of the Passover, and they're heading down to Jerusalem, as any good Jew would do, of course, for this pilgrimage festival where they celebrate the Passover, and they do so in Jerusalem. So as Jesus is going, he has his disciples with him, and he has the crowd slowly gathering behind him as he makes his way down to Jerusalem. Now, in one such moment, there's a quick conversation that I want us to just touch on before we get to our story. We're going to be in the Gospel of Mark today, all throughout. Mark chapter 10, verses 35 to 37 say it this way. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he, Jesus, said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." They're walking down the road. They're making their way to Jerusalem. Something big is coming, no doubt. James and John, two of the disciples, know that Jesus is pretty special. They've seen some pretty miraculous things. And Jesus is now making his way to the capital city, to Jerusalem. And so they come up to Jesus and say, "Hey, well, I want you to do for me whatever we ask of you." Which is pretty bold, by the way. Maybe tomorrow when you go into work, go up to your boss and tell him that. Hey, I want you to do for me whatever I ask of you. Tell me how that goes, report back. But Jesus, of course, being as Jesus always is, says, what do you want me to do for you? And they say, we would love these positions of power and authority. We want to be at your right hand and on your left when you come into glory. And Jesus would go on to say that you don't really know what you're asking. That's what he tells them. You're not really sure what you're asking. You don't really know what you're saying, because when I come into my glory, I'm going to be crowned as a king, but not with a crown that's made of gold. It's going to be a crown of thorns, and my coronation is going to be a crucifixion. So if you want to be on my right and on my left when I come into my glory, it would be upon a cross. Now, they don't know all this. They don't realize all this. But Jesus knows that this is coming in the next few days. Jesus asks, what do you want me to do for you? Hold on to that for just a few moments. Hold on to that. Now it's the next day. The next day is come and gone. The disciples were kind of frustrated that James and John asked this, mostly because they were probably jealous that they didn't ask it first, as the disciples did. So the next day, here we are. The group, the disciples, much of the crowds have made their way all the way down to Jericho. Right? Jericho would be maybe the final stop on the way to Jerusalem. It's just a little bit southeast of the city, but they would make their way to Jericho, and then they would have this long trek up into Jerusalem. See, Jericho is the lowest city on the planet Earth. It's like 1,000-some feet below sea level, and Jerusalem is like 2,700 feet above sea level. So what we're talking about is this 18-mile, 3,500-foot elevation gain hike that they're about to do. Now, here we are in Colorado. A lot of us have done that. No big deal, right? This is a pretty intense hike. There's a lot going on. And let me just finish out the context of when this is taking place. They arrived to Jericho on what we know of as Palm Sunday. This is now Palm Sunday. They have to go from Jericho all the way up to Jerusalem. The very last little bit was when they put Jesus on the donkey and throw their cloaks down and wave the palm branches and shout Hosanna. That's the last little leg, the last mile or two. But for 18 miles, they're coming from Jericho. And there's an important story that happens that I want us to take a look at. So let's look ahead. Still in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, and we're just going down a few verses. The next day, verse 46. And they came to Jericho, as I said. And as he, Jesus, was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he had heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and to say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus and the crowds have arrived to Jericho, and it's in the morning, and he's ready to make this long trek up 18 miles, 3,500 feet elevation gain to Jerusalem for what would be a big week for Jesus. And then there's this blind beggar on the road. That's where a blind beggar would be, of course, where the traffic is, so they could sit there and try to get help in some way. And this blind beggar is shouting out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now, what's interesting is the crowd, the people, begin to tell this beggar to be quiet. Shh, quiet. Stop it. Hush. Don't. But why is this? Why are they shushing this blind beggar? Is it because he's yelling Jesus? No, I don't think so. Many people shouted Jesus. That's what they called him. That was his name, Jesus of Nazareth. It wasn't because he was shouting Jesus. Is it because he was shouting, have mercy on me? No, he would have shouted that every day. He would have been asking for mercy day in and day out by the road for people to help in some way. It wasn't even because he was being loud. Jesus and the disciples and a great crowd, this great parade is making its way from Jericho up to Jerusalem. Everyone is being loud. It's not going to matter for this one guy shouting out. So what is the big deal? Why do they shush this blind beggar? It's because of what he says. Jesus, Son of David. Son of David. What is this Son of David about? Who is this Son of David? And why is this blind beggar yelling Son of David in such a way that gets him shushed by the crowds. Son of David. Well, to say son of David was essentially to say you are a king in the royal line of David. That's what he's shouting out. Here comes Jesus, the king in the royal line of David. And they shush him. You see, 1,000 years earlier for them, not for us, 1,000 years before this story, King David was on the throne over a united kingdom of both Israel and Judah before they had split. We've talked about this before. It was what many would say was the height of the people of God. They had all the worldly power, the earthly power. They had all the finances. They had everything going for them. It was the right king in the right moment. They were defeating their enemies right and left, and it was the height of the kingdom. And so people longed for the days of the great King David, and this was 1,000 years ago. Things, of course, went sideways. The kingdom split. David's lineage would follow with the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom that was there in Jerusalem. And for the next 400 years after King David, there would be many more sons of David. Kings after the royal line of David. In fact, there were 22 of them. 22 kings, sons of David, after the royal line for the next 400 years. From David to Solomon to Rehoboam to Abijah to Asa to Jehoshaphat to, I'm not going to name all of them, but there are many kings of Judah after the royal line of David for 400 years. Until you get to King Zedekiah. King Zedekiah was captured and taken away to Babylon when the Babylonians came under King Nebuchadnezzar and deported almost all of the people to Babylon. The great temple was destroyed. This is 587 BC. The temple was destroyed. The city was destroyed. The kingdom of Judah was just laying in waste. And King Zedekiah was taken away to Babylon, where he would die as the final king in the line of David. The line was over. This royal line of David that had 22 kings, 400 some odd years long, had now ended with King Zedekiah in Babylon in chains. And so now for 6 centuries, think about how long 600 years is. For 600 years, the people are waiting on another son of David. In fact, there would be prophecies. The Isaiahs and the Jeremiahs give us some of these prophecies that someday someone would come to restore the broken line of the kingdom of David. We tend to see these as messianic prophecies. The anointed one, that's what Messiah means, the anointed one would come to rescue us and to restore things to how they once were when David was king 1,000 years ago. And so for now 600 years, there's these prophecies here and there. One day someone will come to restore the line. This will be the great Messiah who's to come. They've been waiting on this son of David, and now here we have this blind beggar by the side of the road shouting out, "Son of David, Son of David, Son of David." And they're, shh, don't say that. What he's yelling is provocative. It's like he's yelling, "Hail the King." I didn't plan our songs today, by the way. All hail King Jesus. That's what he's shouting. Hail King Jesus. But here's the truth. There was a king of the Jews that was present. This is Herod Antipas. Herod was placed by the Romans. His father, Herod the Great, tried to kill Jesus when Jesus was an infant. You remember that story we talk about around Christmas time. His son now, Herod Antipas, is very crazy, just like his dad, and he probably has spies all around listening in for someone else shouting something treasonous like Son of David. Shh. You can't yell that. It's like yelling, "Hail the King." They're not very far from Jerusalem. There's probably Roman soldiers around. They're listening in too. You can't be yelling things like that. Son of David. Here's what's quite beautiful about the story. See, they're in Jericho when he's shouting this, and then they would make their way all the way to Jerusalem. What do they shout when they get to Jerusalem? Let's look at this. This is chapter 11. So just a few verses later, verse 9 and 10 of chapter 11. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. They're now shouting this. They were shushing the blind beggar in the morning, and by the afternoon they're shouting it with him. They've begun to believe. But it started with this blind beggar. The truth is, in Mark's gospel, he is the first to proclaim Jesus as the Son of David. Not a disciple, not one of those followers that were always around, not a Pharisee. This blind beggar on the side of the road, Son of David. Son of David. So let's see what happens with the story. This is good stuff. Back to verse 49 of chapter 10. And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." Let me remind us that Jesus was busy. Very busy. He had a long journey ahead of him all the way to Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. He would go into town the next week where he would flip over the tables and challenge the Pharisees and preach at the temple and be anointed with oil and perfume, and with his hair washed. The lady washes his feet with her hair. All these things take place this next week. Many important things. He would preach on the Mount of Olives. It would lead him to be killed. He was crucified on that Friday. So Jesus has a busy week, a lot going on, and yet Jesus stops. I love Jesus. Anyone else love Jesus? That's why we're here, by the way. Jesus stops. He's got a lot on his mind. Jesus is not too busy for you. He's not too busy for you. Well, my problems aren't as important as these other things. Not to Jesus. Jesus is ready to stop and to say, "Hey, come to me." Jesus is waiting, just like he did with this blind beggar. He is the same for you. Don't think for 1 second Jesus is too busy for your problems. He wants to hear about them, and he wants to do something about them. He says, "Call him over." He calls this young man over. Now let me give away some of the story, if that's okay with you. Jesus heals this man. There's the ending. Jesus heals this man. But what's so fascinating, we're going to take a little look at this. What's fascinating is that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus would heal lots of people. This is the only person healed by Jesus that's given a name. It's the only one. Jesus healed many people. He healed the friend that lowered him down through the roof, and how cool is that story? And he healed him, but we don't know his name. The demoniac, the Gadarene demoniac, he healed him, but we don't know his name. The woman that was sick with the issue, we don't know her name. Tons of wonderful stories, but we're not given any names. In the Gospel of Mark, the only person healed by Jesus, given a name, is this blind beggar in Jericho. Bartimaeus, in case you forgot. Bartimaeus, Mark tells us, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. Which, by the way, Bartimaeus means... You figured it out. Son of Timaeus. That's what it means. So he's saying it twice, essentially. He says, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. He's saying, son of Timaeus, son of Timaeus. This is not for redundancy's sake. He's telling us this for emphasis. Something's going on here. You know, this story is also in the Gospel of Luke. Luke tells us of Jesus healing this blind beggar who was shouting, "Son of David" at Jericho, but there's no name in the Gospel of Luke. So I tend to believe that it was Mark who gave this blind beggar the name Bartimaeus. It was the gospel writer Mark who writes this story for us to now read today. It was Mark who gives us this name Bartimaeus. It was Jesus who healed him, but it was Mark who named him. So again, why? Why Bartimaeus? Why Timaeus? I want to show you a picture. This is Timaeus. Maybe you're familiar with Timaeus, or maybe this is a new idea for you. Timaeus was a very famous philosophical work written by the great philosopher Plato. He writes Timaeus around 360 years before Jesus. This is when those great Greek philosophers lived, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And Plato would write Timaeus. In the time of Jesus, so during this story, this philosophical work was likely Plato's most well-known work, Timaeus. Many people, especially the Greeks and the Hellenists are those people who adopt Greek culture, many people, especially the Greeks and the Hellenists, were quite familiar with Timaeus. In fact, most well-educated Hellenists would have read Timaeus. And who are we talking about when we talk about a well-educated Hellenist in the first century? We're talking about Mark. Mark himself. This is Peter's, the Apostle Peter's, Greek interpreter. We meet him in the book of Acts. Remember I told you last week, Mark's gospel is Peter's story, Peter's account. Mark was his interpreter. Mark is a young, well-educated Hellenist who knows Greek culture and was quite familiar with Timaeus. And what this means is Mark's gospel, which is written, intended for a similar audience, they also would have all known about Timaeus. It was quite well known, and they would have read it and understood the implications of this story. Now, in this dialogue, in this Timaeus, I'm not going to get too into the weeds, but I just want to give you just a bit. Plato, the philosopher. Any people love philosophy? A little bit. I saw a little tiny hand. There we go. That's okay. Philosophy. Plato would mainly share his thoughts and ideas, not by just simply writing them out in prose, saying, "Here's what I think." He would create these dialogues. And so Timaeus is a dialogue, a conversation between Socrates, which was Plato's teacher, and Timaeus. Now, Timaeus is a fictional character made up by Plato, and so what we know is it's Socrates and Plato. I want you to think about Socrates and Plato having a conversation. That is what we see in Timaeus. It's this dialogue. Now, in this dialogue, Timaeus, listen to this, makes a distinction between the visible physical world, which is temporal, and the eternal world of the heavens, which is the spiritual world. Let me read that again. In this dialogue, Timaeus makes a distinction between the visible physical world, which is temporal, temporary, and the eternal world of the heavens, that is the spiritual world. He goes on to say that sight, or you might call it insight, is the most valuable sense given to us by God. So here's a quote from Timaeus. Here's a quote. We'll have it on the screen. A quote from Timaeus. It says, "God bestowed sight upon us in order that we might observe the orbits of reason which are in heaven." Let's read that one more time. God, Plato talks about God, bestowed sight upon us in order that we might observe the orbits of reason which are in heaven. This is from Plato, from Timaeus. Ultimately, when Plato refers to sight, he's referring to insight to perceive the realities of the heavenly world. Plato believed that ultimate reality was not found in the physical world, but in the heavenly spiritual world. This is why some of the early church fathers held Plato with high esteem. Some of them even calling him a Christian before Christ, because of how he viewed God and this difference and separation between the physical world and the eternal heavenly world. Now, our hope in Christ is that these are eventually brought back together. But Plato was acknowledging this, and this was a few hundred years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem and before this story takes place. So we know of insight to perceive the heavens from Timaeus. This is where we as a society learn the perception of insight to see the heavenly world as a reality is from Timaeus. And so now in Mark's gospel, we meet the son of Timaeus, Bartimaeus. We know of insight to perceive the heavens from Timaeus, and now in this story in Mark's gospel, we have Bartimaeus, this blind beggar who cannot see a thing, and he is the first to perceive the truth that Jesus is the Son of David, the king to fulfill the long line that we've been waiting on for a new king to step into the royal line of David to fulfill all of these prophecies. It wasn't anyone that was super smart that followed Jesus. It was this blind beggar who had insight to perceive the true reality of who Jesus was. He could not see where he was physically, but he could perceive and have insight into the heaven realities that Jesus is the King and the Son of David. Amen? He sees Jesus for who he truly is. So let's see how the story comes to a close. We're on to verse 50. And throwing off his cloak, that might be his beggar's cloak or maybe his philosopher's cloak. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" There's that question again. "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on his way. So what's amazing is that we know this story takes place on Palm Sunday at the beginning of this long journey to Jerusalem, and this blind Bartimaeus was with Jesus along the way. Though he shouted, "Son of David," in the morning, he was also shouting, "Hosanna, Son of David," come the afternoon as they had the triumphal entry. He joins in and starts to follow him. And Jesus, of course, asks him this same question. "What do you want me to do for you?" It's the same question Jesus asked one day earlier. He asked James and John, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they wanted positions of power and authority to be to his right and his left. "Lord, lift us up, make us strong and mighty." This is what they desired. And now the next day, Jesus would ask the same question to this blind beggar Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" And he says, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight. Let me see that which I have been missing, Lord. I've gotten the insight to perceive the heavenly realities. Lord, combine that now with my visible sight that I might see the world around me and interact with it, that I might love the people better that are around me. Lord, give me my sight." And Jesus grants him his sight. I love here that Bartimaeus calls Jesus, what does he call him? Rabbi. What does rabbi mean? It means teacher. This is the Gospel of Mark. This is Mark telling us and his audience that ultimately Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, all these great Greek philosopher minds, their teacher is ultimately Jesus. All truth is going to submit itself unto Jesus. All wisdom submits itself to Jesus. Jesus is the one and true teacher. And Mark tells us subtly, he hides it in there for us to find out centuries later what they all knew back when he first wrote it. Jesus is the great teacher. And so today, as we bring this to a close, I want you to hear Jesus asking you this question. What do you want me to do for you? I want you to hear Jesus asking you this question. What do you want me to do for you? I don't want you to hear this from me. This is not from me. This is from Jesus, who is alive, by the way. This is Easter, amen? Easter is not dead. He is alive. Jesus is alive forevermore. And he still beckons us, calls us, leads us, speaks to us. And I want you to hear Jesus asking you today, what do you want me to do for you? Now, I can't answer this question for you. Maybe you need healing in some way. Maybe you need to see the way this blind Bartimaeus needed to see. He needed to have his eyes open, but maybe you have your physical eyes open, but you need your spiritual, heavenly eyes to be open to perceive Jesus in the places that you have missed him along the way. Maybe it's been a long time since you've acknowledged Jesus close by, leading you step by step. Maybe this has been a long journey. Maybe there's healing that's needed for you. And so I want us to respond today. I want us to be able to be prayed for today.